everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Research Notes. On today's episode, we've got Chido, an African feminist researcher and photographer who is based in Harare, Zimbabwe. Her research interests include climate and environmental justice, young feminist movement building, and resource mobilization in line with African feminisms. She has worked with the African Gender Institute at the University of Cape Town and feminist funders such as the Malala Fund and Urgent Action Africa. Her most recent article, Zimbabwe's Third Generation Feminists After COVID-19, is featured in the African Arguments debate series. The article explores how third generation feminists in Zimbabwe mobilize for better sexual and reproductive health right outcomes during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. For more insights on her work, of course, I will link her website below, shilonyarawata.com, and you can also gain access to her documentary and nature photography via that site as well. That was a wholesome introduction, and I'm looking forward to more insights from you, Chido. Welcome to Research Notes, and how are you today?
Thank you so much, Prim. I'm happy to be here. It's really exciting to be in conversation with you. I know this has been an overdue conversation, so happy we're having it.
Nice. I'm glad it's happening today. Despite all the delays, there's always time. And I think our viewers and listeners are more than excited to hear from you. So, to just get us going, the first question that every guest has to answer is, talk to us about what your field of your study is and how did you get to where you are today?
Okay, so I have a very unique background. I think I have a unique background. So when I started off studying, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, human rights lawyer, the ICC, advocating for international rights, for women's rights, making sure that perpetrators at an international level, states as well, are held accountable for their violations.
Mm-hmm.
But as I was studying my BA law degree, I majored in law and international relations. I realized that law is a construct.
Mm-hmm.
So unless the social political conditions are enabling for a just legal system, then there's no point. So I finished my law courses and I graduated with the BA law degree, but I pursued the international relations, a postgraduate up until the master's level. So I have an MA in international relations from the University of Cape Town. And within IR, there are so many like avenues for you as an IR student. You can be in diplomacy, you can work in international development. So I decided through doing like internships that I wanted to be within the international development sector. And I was really interested in how actors responded to crises. So, like looking at disasters, looking at climate, looking at environmental issues, that intersection. But I have always like done inquiries, like, or my theoretical perspective of the world has been through like a feminist lens. So, looking at these issues through a feminist lens, particularly a lens that might not be mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
So it took a bit of time for me to understand like what I'm interested in, where I want to go forward. So like I mentioned, I did some internships. So I got to work at the United Nations University in Tokyo, Japan. I also worked at the African Gender Institute at UCT and some funders as well. And I think like the golden thread throughout was how are we ensuring that women and girls' experiences and voices are shaping the policies, the programs, whatever we're doing, we need to make sure that their voices count, but also their experiences count so that we can address, the gender data gaps that exist because it's kind of crazy that 50% of the population are not accounted for in a lot of our designs in terms of interventions, humanitarian interventions or policy design. So yeah, that's what I studied. And now what I'm doing today is I'm an independent freelance consultant, and I am researching and creating stories of the intersection of gender, climate, and environmental justice, making sure that the experiences of girls are being factored into the discourses around climate change, around environmental justice. So yeah, that's been my journey, and that's how I am where I am today.
Congratulations and well done on all the work. Coming from university, you've studied like hard majors, your law, international relations, and also now trying to be one of the people that are ensuring, the inclusion of feminist perspectives and feminist analysis of development initiatives. I want to note for everyone who's taking down their research notes that Chido said that her work includes being an independent consultant. I used to be very fearful about getting into that area, so I stayed in school for much longer, thinking I would equip myself with new skills. So my second question to you is, you've been at the University of Pretoria, University of Johannesburg, University of Cape Town. You've also mentioned the United Nations University, and also I think you spent a semester at the Sciences Po in France. So reflecting on those experiences, how would you say they shaped you as a thinker and change maker today?
Yeah, hey, when people hear that I went to all of those universities, they're like, what were you doing? And I was like, I wanted to see the country, the best way to travel was through education. So I
Mhm.
thought to myself, when I was at University of Pretoria, to be honest, I thought I would pursue my undergrad and my honors at UP.
Mhm.
But I think there was just a desire to like kind of change my environment and kind of get different perspectives on international relations. So what was really cool at the University of Johannesburg was that they had like uh, basically like an institute, a research institute that focused on African perspectives on international relations.
Mhm.
So you had like general IR, but they were also specializing on what are the perspectives of the AU. How do we ensure that African perspectives are shaping the way that states relate within the continent, but also how states relate with institutions and governments across the globe. So I thought for me that was quite interesting. So one thing that has shaped a lot of my decisions in terms of pursuing academic endeavors at different institutions was I had a reflection to ask myself, what do I want to do and what is the best place to do it? So choosing UP for my law degree when I was still like fresh out of high school and thinking I want to be a lawyer, UP has like the best law school in South Africa and across the continent. It is a very well established, recognized, and they have the Center for Human Rights. So that was the reason of why I picked UP. And then with UJ, I think that was because they had a very Afrocentric approach to IR and political science. And then when I went to Cape Town, it was because of the African Gender Institute. I wanted to be based in, to kind of have like not the safety, but to be surrounded by feminist thinkers as I was developing my own consciousness and my own like theoretical perspectives. So having that access to AGI being ethnicity is what kind of made me move about like looking for what I wanted and who could best help me, shape my thinking. So that's like the professional reason of saying why I'm drawn to these different universities. But I also love travel and I love meeting different people from different cultures. So it was a great way to see South Africa and that perspective of being a student in these different cities. And then going to Sciences Po was, to be quite honest, that was like sheer luck. Like I think I was during my masters, there was a information session from the exchange department, and a friend of mine was like, "Hey, let's go and see." And I was like, "Going to our masters to do like we got a thesis, you know?" But she was like, "No, let's just see." what it's all about, because we had some exchange students in our class and we were like, oh, we would love to like have that experience as well. So I just went to the information session, and it was really informative, but it was also really cool. And I had the grades. I was doing very well in my master's and my postgraduate, and I wrote, a cover list. I wrote my motivation of why I wanted to go to Sciences Po. And Sciences Po was really good in the fact that it has like I think over 300 courses in like different development, IR,
Mm.
international development, IR related like subjects. So I was starting to lean more and wanting to specialize in environmental policy, and they had a couple of courses on that. And it's in Paris, like it's a center of international development organizations. UNESCO has their office
Mhm.
there, so it was about getting like greater access to those spaces because I think um it becomes a bit more tangible when you're in a space that has a lot of these like headquarters. And I remember even getting when I was in Paris, I got to go to the OECD conference on Africa. They were having an Africa centered conference, and I remember the former Minister of Home Affairs, Mango Dusi, was there. He was a panelist, and he was talking about migration, and I was like, okay, what you're presenting in this global space is very different to what's happening in your country. So I'm
Mm.
interested, especially as a foreign national on a student visa. So it was getting to have those interactions and knowing the value of those interactions
Mm.
that enabled me, that like inspired me to go to Sciences Po to have the semester. The work is quite rigorous. Like it wasn't the typical like skip class, go and like see the city kind of thing. Like
Mm.
you were only allowed to miss like two classes at Sciences Po and for like the whole, and it was just a big culture shock. And somebody was like to me, you don't come to Sciences Po to like a fun semester abroad. Like, no, you don't do that. Like this is serious stuff, but the connections that you make and just the knowledge that you got and the skill set. And it was such an international course where you had, people from, I met a friend from Niger. I knew some people from the UK. I got to meet
Oh.
like classmates from Canada, but also from Russia and from Ukraine. Like my roommate was from Kazakhstan. And, it was just like getting to be in a center where you meet young people from all over the world who are all interested and driven by the political system. They want to shift it, whether they had
Mm.
conservative perspectives or whether they were quite liberal or whether they were feminists themselves. It was quite interesting to be in a hub. So these are like the motivations of why I went to these different institutions, and I think they really helped me understand like it's important to know what you want from the world and how you want to shape these different institutions that are driving the way that states interact. And if you want to have better outcomes, specifically coming from Zimbabwe, coming from the African continent, where as a bloc we are marginalized in terms of how international politics is designed. Like when we think of the position of the African states within the United Nations, the fact that we are still vying and trying to push for the transformation of the Security Council. Why is it that way? And how can we leverage our collective power to ensure that we can we can transform the way that the international global system of politics and interactions shifts positively into like our favor. So I think that's how these like different experiences shape the way as I am as a thinker and the change maker that I am today.
Wow, amazing. Like I'm getting a lot of intentionality here and openness to learning. Oftentimes I'm guilty of choosing city in the first instance because it was the best university on the continent at the time that I applied to it. I only came to know, for example, about the University of Johannesburg's strong focus on Africa in IR when I was doing my postdoc, last year. I went to the Institute of Pan-African Thought. I forgot the full name. And I was just so stunned by, the space,
Yeah.
people engaged. And I really felt like I was doing international relations in an African setting, despite the limitation of being
Yeah.
in South Africa. So really, I want to urge anyone who's also thinking about Africa and IR, let them know that UJ exists because adding on to your experience and also your research in terms of that. Also with regards to UP being the best place for an LLB. And also, I think the University of Cape Town is amongst maybe about 4 universities in South Africa where they've got a dedicated gender studies institute. And it's now the African Feminist Studies Department, the academic wing of it. So really, if someone wants to build their foundation, on feminist knowledge or to interact with more African feminists academically, those are spaces to be at. And apply for those exchange programs. Don't be afraid, if your university is offering that. And in as much as France wasn't the holiday it was meant to be, I'm glad you've got these lifelong takeaways and hope that you did get to go around, as a photographer and also just take in the space without being philosophical about, everything.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, like I used the weekends and I
Mhm.
was really cool being a student because there were like a lot of places that you could go for free or discounted, like going to the roof like
Ooh,
for free. And I was like, and it was kind of crazy because it was like 15 minutes walk from campus.
nice.
So we would go and go to like to Museum d'Orsay as well. That was like another like 15 minutes. Like it was kind of like it was very it was a big culture shock. I won't lie. Like there was a lot of things where I was like, this is so accessible to me. But at the same time it was very jarring. Like where Sciences Po is like it is a very uh I want to use an
Massive.
appropriate term, not the slang term. It was very like it was a very like bougie, it was a
Ooh,
very
okay.
it's a very like opulent part of the city. Like you would
Mm,
like get out of Saint Germain train station and you would see like there's this very popular French restaurant like that's on the corner. You would see like Versace, you would see Ralph Lauren, and then but you would also see somebody who's homeless like right next door. So it was like this place of contradiction, and then you go to Sciences Po and like as an outsider I just thought it was like a university, but I didn't realize like the role that it had in French
mm,
political culture, how like if somebody wants to be a diplomat or wants to be, a prime minister or be part of the political system of political leadership, they start at Sciences Po. Like it's one of like those feeder schools, and
mm,
just realizing the level of interactions that you have with French students and students who are coming from francophone countries, like just the linkages between that. But it was also cool to be in Paris and to kind of experience the different cultural aspects of it, like the museums. But it was also frustrating because there were some museums that were holding like African artifacts. I remember there was one exhibition that I went to, and it was on Madagascar and just the different like cultural artifacts, historical facts that were there. And I was like, I'm Zimbabwean and I'm in the same regional um, organization as Madagascar, but I'm
mm.
learning more about Madagascar's history when I'm in France than when I am located
In Southern
in my
Africa.
home country or in like in a neighboring country. And I thought there was something fundamentally wrong about that. So it was also like getting in those social spaces and asking, who is curating these historical monuments, what is the purpose of it? And there's this book that I've been reading about, forgot the title, but it's essentially looking at like, the colonial history of museums, like whose voice gets to shape the history, like how were these artifacts obtained and why are you still holding on to them, and saying that the countries where the stuff was stolen from through colonial conquest do not have the means to like keep them, but they were well kept before they were raided from. So
Definitely.
it's like it was also like being in France was kind of like dealing with that contradiction because I love art, I love history. Um, I love learning about a particular place. So it was fine when I was learning about French, art history. But I thought it was very problematic when they were keeping artifacts from former colonial, entities of theirs. So I think that was the fun stuff. Like I would go there, I mean, I'd go to restaurants and you'd have like the cliche, like having your coffee on a corner cafe and seeing, life go by and getting to interact with different people. So it was there, that aspect of being an exchange student, but I think it was also being critical of the spaces that you were interacting with because you couldn't enjoy it blind if you were coming from our particular context.
Yes, definitely. And I also think it also comes out of who you are, individually. Some people would just go to such a context, marvel at everything, speak about how they're African artifacts, and not even think about what does it mean. So I think
Hmm.
it's very important that you also emphasize that. I hope people that watch this before they've been to Sciences Po or anywhere else in the world will start thinking critically about what we see across the world and the representations and narratives, and also who are the curators, like what you said would be very important to gain those insights. And why is it that maybe it's best for them to do that curation in those spaces as opposed to us maybe having like museums of Africa in different SADC or even African states as a whole? I think I'm inspired to actually do some research on that. Thank you so much for bringing that up.
Yeah.
Yes. And then speaking about new lessons, I noted that you mentioned how you gain more insights around, for example, environmental sustainability and a wide range of topics at Sciences Po. So climate, for example, is popular now more than ever. I mean, we keep hearing about it. We keep also hearing about sustainability. Please speak to us about the work you've done thus far and how did you get into it, coming from, human rights, IR, feminism, and now deciding, to have a focus on climate topics.
Okay, so it actually came about through my master's. So my master's dissertation looked at how three global health actors were responding to persistent cholera outbreaks in Harare.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I focused on cholera, humanitarian actors, was because a lot of the times when we talk about this disease, which is like a diarrheal disease, but it's a disease that should not exist when you have a functioning water and sanitation system in your
Mm,
city, in your location, right? But then you also kind of needed to unpack like what are the social determinants of health? Why is it that there are particular groups of society that are being affected by a very preventable disease? And how are international actors interacting with the state to respond to this disaster, to this health
mm,
disaster? So when I was looking into that relationship, and it was inspired by, being from Harare, living from it, having
mm.
experienced this disease when I was much younger, and actually before like the major cholera outbreaks of 2008,
Oh,
I
okay.
was just wondering like, why are we suffering from something that is so preventable? And how is the state responding? Because it's a deeply structural problem that
Mm-hmm.
is driving this event that keeps happening perpetually, right?
Mm,
So in 2008 to 2009, Zimbabwe experienced its like worst cholera outbreak in history, about 4,000 deaths of people. It
mm,
spread through to South Africa and to other neighboring countries as well. Um, and it just spread like wildfire, even though the measures to prevent it and to like, address it are quite simple. But in a country that is under-resourced, you have an underfunded public health system,
mm-hmm.
but then you also are having particular narratives that are created and sustained by a political and governance structure that has a very negative relationship with humanitarian actors because they are seen as agents of the West, regime changing individuals. So it was interesting to see how a health disaster had actually been politicized in one particular period in time. But it goes back to that basic issue of water and sanitation, of that not being available. But now solutions that are being given are like, let's drill boreholes in these hotspot areas, right? But the thing is, we're having droughts. So we are mining groundwater, but this groundwater is not being replenished because we're not getting enough rains. So what happens to access to water? So that was kind of like some of the findings that came out when I was having my interactions with different stakeholders. So that is where, the interest in climate started coming out for me. It came from a personal, but also came from this research context of looking at a disease. How will climate actually worsen the health outcomes for people? How will climate change worsen health outcomes from people? But also, how will it, you know, affect certain gender norms that occur within a household. So now when we're talking about water, we're talking about care duties, we're talking about labor division within the house. So I went in with the assumption that because women and girls are the ones who have the responsibility to go and collect water, they would be more susceptible to this disease. But when you actually look at the data, it's statistically insignificant, right? Which is crazy because I was like, I thought women and girls would be the ones having higher cases of cholera, but it wasn't. But the disease which you did see statistical significance was typhoid. So men were more likely to acquire typhoid than women. And when I was talking to representatives from the city of Harare Health Department, they alluded it to, some of the social spaces that men might be going to might not be hygienic. They might be getting, like they might be going to get like your sata or your pap and meat in a place that might not have the greatest sanitation. So that might be why they are more susceptible. So now I was thinking to myself, okay, like, so how does this make sense? Because we know that when there are water issues, women might be more affected. But what is it? So looking beyond the data and seeing the relationship with climate and gender, but also seeing what are some of the data gaps that are there. So this like research of mine is really what started getting me interested in the nexus between gender, climate, and also environmental justice. Why is it that we are having prolonged droughts or frequent droughts when they are happening? What are the reasons for that? And then you're starting to see the linkages and learning about greenhouse emissions and how that contributes to the warming of the contributes to global warming. But then you ask yourself, okay, like what processes drive greenhouse gas emissions? And then you start to learn about industrialization. Which countries were first to industrialize, but how are they able to industrialize? And then you start to see, okay, like countries, particularly from the metropole, from colonial states, or those who were able to use extraction from the global south to drive and to sustain their own development and their own economies, have historically contributed to this climate crisis. So, like, keeping and unpacking the layers is what really has made me realize, like, this crisis is not of our own making, but we are suffering from the impacts. I mean, like, there's always a statistic which is that Africa has only contributed 3 to 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but we are like at the forefront of the climate crisis. It's true, we are at the forefront of it. Like right now, we are experiencing extreme heat. Like I was reading yesterday in Johannesburg, it was like 38 degrees or something like that. We experienced that in December in Harare. And there are impacts, there are health impacts, there's heat stress, there's heat rashes, but like just realizing that something that might seem so abstract is impacting us on a personal day-to-day level. And I
Mm.
think trying to bring out those linkages through research, but also through like digital ways, accessible ways, because I think right now the climate discourse is very much like it's a lot better now, but I think at a point it was scientists speaking to scientists or
Yeah.
scientists speaking to government officials. And it was good that the scientists were bringing up and saying, you know, we're looking at the data and it's showing that how we are progressing today as a society is going to lead us to very detrimental points. We are going to
Mm.
reach significant climate tipping points. And once we reach those tipping points, we can't go back.
Sure.
So it's important that that literature is there, but it's about like how can we communicate this information into simple terms, into, you know, terms that everybody can understand. And the best way for a lot of people is through visual and audio means. So I think that's why I've been trying to focus on the storytelling through
Mm.
blogs, trying to break down certain concepts, like developing a short film about food safety and waste management in Harare, one of the big problems that we face in Harare, but also in other urban dwellings in the country, is the fact that we just have poor waste management from the municipality. Waste is not collected frequently enough, on schedule, and they are stating their own reasons.
Mm.
Conflicts between local government and central government in terms of having adequate resources to purchase trucks and right. So those are like the political reasons of why we are not getting
Sure.
service delivered. But what is the impact of that in terms of the environmental health, in terms of the personal health of people as they are adopting negative coping mechanisms? So now people are burning their rubbish,
Mm.
and that contributes to air pollution. You're having very harmful chemicals being released when you burn plastic. It's actually better to do compost building. And
Mm.
once you build a compost, you can put some seeds in your backyard. People's gardens vary in size, but I think one thing that has been kind of like um, swept through or ingrained in a lot of people is like at least have your little garden with spinach and kovo and
Mm-hmm.
grape or something, like just so that you can have some fresh vegetables for yourself and you're able to sustain yourself. Especially as a lot of people, because of the bad economic situation, lack of access to jobs, to permanent full paying jobs, um, people are in a situation where they cannot afford to buy certain foodstuffs in the shop. So it's better to try and produce your own food. So looking at food waste, how can you separate it from your normal waste,
Mm-hmm.
putting it in a compost and growing food, how you can grow food in plastics. That was something that we've done at home, and that was quite an interesting innovation. And just sharing that through a short film and sharing it within like the community WhatsApp group on YouTube so that people just have some knowledge of how they can kind of cope when the state does not fulfill its duties that it should be. But
Mm.
also, you are living in this horrible climate context and you need to be able to adapt to ensure that your food needs are met. So it's been through like those different initiatives that I've been trying to inform and engage and raise awareness about the different aspects of what is climate change, how it affects you, and how you can adapt or how you can like reduce the impacts of climate change on your day to day.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And, I hope that people that had questions around, the climate and what they can do, because you mentioned adaptation, for example, we have to. We are living with these different situations, and unfortunately, within most of our context, you cited Harare as an example, but a lot of African towns and cities, it's so devastating how waste management is not prioritized. There's a lot of political fights around, we don't have X, Y, and Z, but I do think that, more efforts could be made. I have lived in a time when waste management was happening. And so the shift to, even though there's multiple explanations, I don't see like a solid base for them. For me, I end up thinking that, it's just parties trying to deprive each other of
Mm,
popularity by depriving each other of like resources and whatnot. So I'm really grateful also that you are participating in, I use the word research communication because people often ask, okay, you went to school, you've got all this education, your thesis was amazing, you ended up finding out, dynamics that come from, you know, sustainable practices. How are you educating people? And so
mm,
using different platforms, and you've mentioned WhatsApp, which I think, although we don't have many people using mobile technology, is one of the key ways of reaching out to people nowadays. Even if it's someone hearing from someone who read a WhatsApp message, but it goes around even through the word of mouth.
mm,
And also, one of the key points I wanted to mention based on what you said, for example, some practices can start at home, intentionally looking at your waste, dividing it, seeing what can be used for composting, seeing what can be sent maybe to like a waste paper collector, educating yourself on, what to do with the plastics because I've lived in areas where the dump sites, yes, was so massive and people resorted to burning,
mm.
but half the time you don't know what is exploding there. You don't know what the smell that's coming out of there is going to lead to. You're just like, okay, every morning there's burning and the air is just toxic. But over time,
Yeah,
people develop diseases. You might not even be able to trace it back to that particular area. So we have to also, take a step forward to protecting ourselves and helping ourselves to survive longer. Although we can't do much with the little funds we may have, but I do think community organizing can go a long way.
definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Yes. All right. So I'm gonna spare you the heat. Hopefully the questions haven't been difficult. I mean, you do this every day of your life. The next segment of this episode requires you, to ask me a question or a few questions if we've got any. So, Chido, would you like to ask me anything?
Yeah, I would.
Mm,
So, like, given the fact that you have a strong research background and
mm,
exploring the work that you are doing, do you think there are better ways to kind of incorporate knowledge about, climate adaptation? Like, what are we seeing from government states? How is that shaping their policies?
mm,
Like, how can we use advocacy as a tool to influence African governments to perhaps incorporate more local level climate adaptation measures,
mhm,
like trying to see like how they can use their power at the AU or if they go to COP, like climate negotiators,
mhm.
African climate negotiators, like how can they better incorporate the voices and the experiences from the grassroots level when they are developing their policies?
Okay. So I'm gonna start with the international level one, which I think is the most complex and the one with the most depressing foreseeable outcomes. African heads of state and activists have come together several times, mentioned the adverse effects that have they've had as a continent and identified, for example, how industrialization in different parts that are not Africa led to some of these outcomes. And I think the debate on, okay, we need compensation, and mostly the compensation that's required is in the form of, money, is where most are stuck. But I think rather have those few funds and put them into sustainability activities, but also continue, trying to make sure that actors who are not coming to the table and are taking accountability for what they've caused do so. I do think diplomacy is a back and forth, you know, act.
Mm,
It requires a lot of tactful engagement. Sometimes it requires you to bargain with something, and we can only maybe bargain as a continent, to say that in response to recent adverse climate effects, we are going to say, no European tourists to Africa for the next so many years. Because,
yeah,
you want to come to Durban, but Durban half the time is experiencing these heavy floods because of X, Y, and Z, identifying the adverse effects of fires in particular areas because of some of the effects of this climate issues. Of course, what I'm proposing is a very, drastic measure, which might even have harsher effects on us. But I think bargaining collectively is important and continuously. As for what to do back home, I think we tend to rely a lot on waiting for what the scientists have to say or what people who are currently enrolling in an environmental humanities program are going to say, or what someone is doing who's doing feminism and the environment is going to say, when in fact the real research should come down to what is happening in communities. And in as much as some adaptation methods may not be good, what have people been doing? And what can be done to ensure that, they adapt in a healthy way? So I've come across
Mm,
people who do research outside academia with communities that have been affected, for example, by artisanal mining, or where people have not being able to adapt in terms of like what the soil and the rainfall that they now get can, yield or produce are doing, so that we can see how best to adapt at the community level, at a geographical level, in terms of like your provinces, and at country level. And also information sharing is very important. But I think the major drawback is that a lot of rulers are apart from the people when it's not campaigning or voting season. They tend to come
yeah,
back at some point, and then they actually come back with food, even, for example. But so if you know that I've got a food issue, what about this whole 4 year period? You didn't come
yeah,
to check how my food issue is being addressed. So I think the political will is not there, so that's very challenging. But not to sideline the fact that there are people that are doing different practices within their communities or regions. I once met someone who was looking at conserving wildlife and speaking about how in their region in the past, they used to take duties to go and take care of animals in as much as they're wild, prevention from poachers, for example. And that has been happening. So even in terms of checking out to say we used to have certain animal life in our area, they are depleting. How do we deal with that? So to actually find out, get insights, journalism we say is shrinking, but there's a lot of work they can actually go out there and do, put it on the
yeah.
radio, put it in the papers or on TV so that others can be like, actually, we've been doing the same, or we've been doing it in
Mm,
different ways. So I think information sharing is important, but we need to have people that are actively involved in seeking out this information and promoting the information sharing. Otherwise, in terms of the adverse effects, I think, that's where we really need our governments. I keep getting shocked
mm,
when we experience a flood that's similar to one that occurred 6 months ago, but people are evacuated at a very late stage. People are not
yeah.
even informed about what should be done about disaster management, but there's so many programs in universities that are on disaster and risk management. So I do think that the information, some of it is already there, but it's about how it's communicated, and it's also about um, real political action, whether to move people ahead of time, and also in terms of like how they then address communities or populations once that has happened. So I think we're not
Mm,
making enough of the research we have and the information that's available. Yeah.
yeah.
So as a researcher, I think one of my frustrations is also the realization that if you don't have the right networks and policy making, or in SADC, or at the United Nations, or the African Union, you end up just being, an advocate shouting from a particular space and not having the partners that are needed to address concerns. So I
Mm,
think if people are looking to be researchers and achieving impact through research, just be aware of that, the network building that needs to be done to increase the impact of the work that you've done as a researcher or as an advocate.
mm.
I don't
Yeah,
know if you
that last
agree, if you
point.
want to add
No,
on.
that last point is so important because I think like it can be quite easy to be stuck um in the shouting advocate
Mm,
position.
yes.
And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think
Nothing wrong.
sometimes you if you have the aspiration to positively shape policy and governance mechanisms to ensure that the impact is felt throughout, like from a ward level right up until the national level, if you want that kind of impact, you're right, you kind of do need to have the certain networks, like to be interacting in certain spaces. And I think that's something that is so critical for young people to actually understand, that there are different ways of doing advocacy and there are different ways of doing research. So you can do the research within the academy and you're just talking to peers, but if you want to do the research outside of journal publications, you're gonna have to step outside of that bubble and start interacting with different people who have influence in different spheres so that you can achieve the impact that you want. So I think it's really important, but also I think it's just like you said, like take that action from the home to the community level. Like you rightly said, we don't necessarily need to wait for scientists or from people who have an environmental or humanities background to tell us that there is a problem. You can see the problem. How do you want to address it? And what small measures can you take on a day-to-day level to ensure that we are protecting and improving the health of our planet, but improving the health of those around us as well? Because I think it's important to realize, like, climate change impacts us on so many levels, and it affects our mental health, it affects our physical health. For women, it affects menstrual health as well. So how are we like kind of addressing all of these different aspects of affecting our health, affecting our livelihoods, affecting our productivity? So I think once we get to like that level of understanding how it's affecting us on a day to day, we can start to see more shifts and maybe also change our consumption habits as well, because we are contributing in that way. So do you really need like 5 Nikes? Do you really need
Yes, because if the demand is
It's like
there,
asking
those
yourself that, like, do
sweatshops
I
are
have to
gonna be
buy the latest iPhone when it comes out? Like, I think sometimes it's like asking
mm,
ourselves certain habits that we have. Like, I'm not saying like you need to have something forever, but maybe prolong the time that you do your upgrades and actually like say like, has this device really reached its long life? Because some
true.
people can have devices for quite a while.
True.
So yeah, just seeing that. Yeah,
And
I think maybe
others are
that's
all
what I
about
would like.
keeping up with the trends. Mm.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, I think keeping up with the trends is why we're in this mess, like, I mean, I'm not to say like, I think there are particular regions in the world that are more responsible for ultra consumerism, like, and who are constantly purchasing and dumping and,
True.
like, they are definitely, but I think even within our developing economies, there are certain consumption habits that we are having that are negatively impacting the environment. And to take a step back and see how can we address them.
Definitely, yeah. And I think one other point in relation to that is we usually get educated on some of these issues not from like your primary level education. I mean, if you're introducing agriculture from primary school level, hopefully you're also introducing topics such as climate and sustainability. Of course, teachers may touch on it, maybe when they teach you about weather patterns and whatnot, but I think intentionally outlining all the key areas in which the climate situation we're in has been caused by certain elements without only isolating or blaming like just industrialization or just mining, but like being truthful and bringing out factors like the conversation we're having right now, but also how consumption patterns determine the demand for certain products and all of that. So
Mm.
I think that's where also your digital storytelling comes in. Younger people are the ones that usually consume this kind of media, that have find ease in gaining insights from that type of like information or communication. So yeah, keep up the good work, and I wish you all the best with future
Thank you.
documentaries and everything.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Prim. I'm happy that we got to talk and I just got to share
Yeah.
some insights, but I also learned quite a bit from you as well. So
Really?
it was a
Okay.
yeah, it was. Like it was a good conversation. It didn't feel like it was a lecture, but it was a conversation and
Nice.
learning.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm really happy that we had this chat today.
Great. I'm happy that you came here today. Hopefully, you can join us for a future episode, maybe not research notes format. But I'll keep you in the loop because I'm also hoping to
Yeah,
get out of like my space on Zoom and interacting with people in person.
definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
So, Chido, do you have any last words for our viewers and listeners? It can be life advice, anything. It doesn't have to be strictly research or academia.
I think just be intentional about what you do in life. Like,
Mm-hmm.
just if you want something, take the steps to get there. So yeah, I think that's something that I could say for my own life is if you want something, take the necessary steps to get there. Sometimes it will take a bit long.
Mm-hmm.
I think like living in this society of instant gratification, you want something like now, like it must
Yes.
happen like right now.
Mm,
But and there are some people where things just happen like there
true.
and then. But I think for a majority of us in society, it's a long and steady walk that gets us there. And there's beauty in that. And I think also just like embrace your surroundings wherever you are. There's
Mhm.
beauty in everything. And yeah, I think that's just what I'd leave. Be intentional with what you want, slow and steady, and embrace the beauty around you.
Nice. Be intentional with what you want, slow and steady, and embrace the beauty around you. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for that, Chido. I hope everyone who's listening in felt inspired. And remember, I'm going to put down Chido's link to the website in this video. So do go check it out and follow her work as the years unravel. Thank you so much once again, Chido, for joining us today on Research Notes. This is a podcast series dedicated to demystifying the world of research by engaging in conversations with a diverse set of intellectuals, academics, industry professionals, and creators. It's goodbye for now.